Mason Hill, a young soldier just discharged from service, was only looking for firewood with his dog, Bolt, when he stumbled upon a wrecked police cruiser deep in the snowy woods. The windshield was shattered by gunfire. Blood stained the snow, and just outside the door a young officer lay dying, shot in the shoulder, barely breathing. His radio was dead. No backup was coming. He had dragged himself out, hoping someone would find him. That someone was Mason. But saving him was only the beginning, because behind that bullet was a secret worth killing for. And now Mason and Bolt are being hunted. What happened next will make you believe in miracles again. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Lakewood, Montana. A mountain town swallowed by winter. The kind of place where the air itself seemed frozen, where even sound struggled to move through the heavy snow. Pines bent under the white weight, their branches creaking as the wind screamed across the valley. Night had already claimed the forest, leaving only the ghostly reflection of the moon on untouched drifts of snow. Mason Hill pulled his scarf tighter against his jaw. His breath came out in slow clouds as he trudged through the woods behind his grandfather's old cabin. He had been back home for only 2 weeks, if this place could still be called home. The cabin, leaning and cracked by years of neglect, was all that was left after the army, after Afghanistan, after losing nearly everyone he'd ever called brother. At 27, Mason had the look of a man older than his years. Broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, his hair short enough to remind anyone of military precision. He moved like someone who still listened for distant echoes, always scanning, always aware. His jacket was military issue, faded olive with frayed cuffs. His boots had crossed deserts before they met this snow. Beside him walked his German shepherd, Bolt, 5 years old, black and tan, his gait steady but marked by a faint limp in his hind leg. Bolt had served too once. They had been paired in the field as medic and detection unit. When a roadside blast crippled the dog's leg, Mason had signed the discharge papers to bring him home. 2 soldiers, scarred and quiet, now patrolling their own small corner of the world. The forest was heavy with silence, except for the crunch of boots and paws breaking through the snow. Mason swung his flashlight in slow arcs, its pale beam cutting through the fog of his breath. He wasn't hunting, just gathering, searching for fallen branches to keep the cabin stove burning through the night. It was the kind of simple task that kept his mind still. No orders, no alarms, just cold air, solitude, and the steady rhythm of snow beneath his boots. But even that fragile peace didn't last long. Bolt's ears twitched, his head lifted sharply, nose testing the air. A low growl built in his chest. Mason froze. His instincts kicked in before thought. He clicked off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed them. "Easy, boy," he whispered, lowering himself behind a cluster of spruce. The night was so quiet he could hear his heartbeat, and Bolt's soft breathing beside him. Then it came. Faint, distant, almost swallowed by the wind. Bang! A single gunshot. Then another, then a third, sharper, closer this time. Echoes bounced off the hillsides like ghosts fleeing through the dark. Mason's pulse slowed instead of rising, an old reflex honed by years of survival. His eyes narrowed, searching the tree line. Somewhere out there, beyond the frozen creek, someone was shooting, and, from the rhythm of it, not hunting. Bolt pressed against his leg, alert. "Yeah," Mason murmured, voice low and steady. "I heard it too." He flicked the flashlight back on, keeping it low near the ground. Snowflakes drifted through the beam like sparks of ash. The forest stretched silent and endless ahead of him. He wasn't sure why he started walking toward the sound. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the soldier still buried inside him, the one who couldn't ignore trouble, even when it wasn't his fight. He adjusted the strap of his pack, one gloved hand brushing the handle of the combat knife strapped to his thigh. The steel was cold through the fabric, but familiar, comforting in a strange way. A soldier's reflex that refused to die. The woods ahead seemed darker now, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Mason glanced down at Bolt. "Stay close," he whispered. The dog's eyes caught the faint light reflecting gold in the snow. Together they began to move, quiet, deliberate, leaving a trail of footprints that would soon be buried by the storm closing in behind them. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of gunfire faded into the wind. Mason moved with caution, each step through the snow deliberate and silent. Bolt stayed close, ears alert, tail low, his breath visible in the icy air. The sound of gunfire had long faded, but the tension lingered in Mason's chest like the echo of a war drum. They moved down a slope where the pines thinned, revealing a narrow snow-covered trail used by hunters and the occasional ranger. That's when he saw it. The vehicle came into view like a ghost emerging from the mist, a black and white police cruiser half buried in snow, its red and blue lights still flashing weakly. The driver's side door was swung open. Wind carried flakes through the broken windshield, now spiderwebbed with bullet impact. One of the front tires was flat. The trunk hung slightly ajar. Mason's pace quickened. He scanned the area first. No signs of anyone else, no footprints other than a chaotic scuffle pattern near the car. He raised the flashlight and pointed it toward the ground. Blood. A trail of it, smeared and dotted across the snow, leading away from the car and toward a thicket of brush. "Bolt, stay," Mason ordered firmly, and the dog froze in place. He followed the trail quickly, heart tightening. 10 yards from the cruiser, partially obscured by branches and powdery snow, lay a man in a dark Navy patrol uniform. He was face down, one arm twisted under him, the other clawed into the snow as if trying to drag himself forward. Mason dropped to his knees and rolled him gently onto his back. The officer was white, in his early 30s, with close-cut brown hair and a square jawline dusted with frost. A bullet had torn through the top of his left shoulder, blood saturating the fabric. His badge, scratched and half covered in snow, read Harlan. Mason pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Pulse. Weak. But there. He leaned close. "Officer? Can you hear me?" The man's eyelids fluttered. His lips parted, breath shallow and rasping. Bolt broke command and padded over, nose twitching. He circled the 2 of them, then sat close to the officer's side and let out a low whine. "Good boy," Mason whispered. He unzipped his pack and yanked out the emergency thermal blanket. After brushing snow off the man's torso, he laid it over him and knelt beside the wound. It was a through and through. The bullet had gone in clean near the collarbone and exited the back, but the bleeding hadn't stopped. Mason reached for gauze and pressure bandages. His gloved fingers worked quickly, layered with the calm urgency that only came from experience. The officer shivered violently. "You're all right," Mason said under his breath. "You're not alone." He fumbled with the man's shoulder radio, lifting it to his mouth. "This is Mason Hill. I have a wounded officer near mile marker 16, north of Hollow Pine Trail. He's been shot. Repeat, officer down." Static. The same garbled hiss replied, no matter how many. Times, Mason keyed the mic. He glanced at his phone. No service. "Of course," he muttered. Bolt lay down beside the officer, pressing his warm body close. His fur was thick enough to shield most of the cold. The man stirred slightly, murmuring incoherent words. "Keep pressure on that wound, buddy," Mason said, as he wrapped the officer's arm tight against his chest. "I'm going to get us out of here." He rose and surveyed the surroundings. A light snow was still falling, but the air was growing colder. Wind pushed harder through the trees, and the sun had long disappeared beyond the ridge. They wouldn't last out here. Mason looked back toward the cruiser. It was no use. Disabled, shot out, tires flat. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to escape. They wanted Officer Harlan dead, and they thought they'd succeeded. Mason returned, knelt, and slid his arms beneath the officer's back and knees. "I'm going to lift you now," he warned. The man let out a strangled groan as Mason hoisted him up, his body heavier with winter gear and blood-soaked fabric. Bolt barked sharply once, not out of alarm, but alert. Mason's head jerked toward the woods. Silence, then wind. But no movement. Still, his skin crawled. He hurried back toward the path. The cabin wasn't far. Maybe 15 minutes at a fast pace, but carrying a full-grown man through snow made that a brutal estimate. Bolt walked beside them, occasionally sniffing the wind. Mason's boots dug deep into the icy trail. His breath came heavy, controlled. Years in the field had trained him not to panic, not even now. "Hang on," he said to the officer as he adjusted his grip. "We're close." Behind them, the cruiser's lights flickered one last time before fading out completely. The forest was an endless blur of white and black as Mason struggled through the deep snow, the wounded officer limp in his arms. The storm howled against his face, biting through his scarf, but he kept moving. Each breath burned his lungs. Bolt ran ahead, clearing the path, occasionally turning back with worried eyes. By the time Mason reached the clearing, his arms and back screamed with exhaustion. The small cabin appeared through the snow like a fading memory. Crooked, wooden, the porch light flickering weakly through the storm. He kicked open the door with his boot and carried the officer inside. The sudden warmth hit him like a wave. The air was heavy with smoke and the faint scent of pine resin. He laid the man down on the old couch near the cold fireplace. The officer's face was pale, his uniform soaked with blood and melting snow. Mason dropped his pack beside the couch and went straight to the fireplace. He tossed in logs, a handful of kindling, and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, crackling to life, filling the room with flickering orange light. "Hang in there, man," Mason muttered as he returned to the couch. "You're not dying in my cabin." He unbuttoned the officer's jacket and cut through the blood-stained shirt with his knife. The bullet wound near the shoulder was deep, a clean entry, but heavy bleeding. Mason recognized the signs of shock immediately: shallow breathing, pale skin, trembling hands. He pulled his medical kit from the pack, his motions calm and practiced. He cleaned the wound with iodine, ignoring the officer's faint groan. Then, with a steady hand, he pressed gauze tightly against the entry wound, wrapped a pressure bandage around the shoulder, and tied it off beneath the arm to stop the bleeding. The smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke from the fire. Bolt paced nearby, whining softly. Mason looked up. "Easy, boy. He's going to make it." The dog eventually lay down near the couch, resting his head beside the officer's hand, as if guarding him. Mason sat back on his heels and studied the man. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with short brown hair and a rugged face that suggested years of fieldwork. His name tag read L. Harlan. The badge on his chest bore the Lakewood police insignia. The officer stirred faintly, his lips moving. Mason leaned closer but caught only fragments. Truck, white, masks. The words slurred together before the man slipped back into unconsciousness. Mason frowned. Whatever had happened out there, it wasn't random. He glanced toward the window. The wind outside had grown violent, snow pelting against the glass in hard bursts. No one would be coming through that storm tonight. He stood, moving to the door, and slid the wooden bar lock into place. Then he pulled the heavy curtains across every window, sealing out the night. He'd learned in war that sometimes safety meant disappearing, making yourself invisible until daylight. The cabin creaked with the sound of wind pressing against the walls. Mason checked the corners of the room. No gaps, no open vents. He turned off the small lamp near the window and let the fire be their only light. When he returned to the couch, Bolt was still awake, eyes fixed on the door. Mason sat beside him, rubbing the dog's fur absently. "You're not the only one who smells trouble," he murmured. He checked the officer's pulse. Weak, but steady. The bleeding had slowed. That was good, and the worst was over, for now. He pulled an extra wool blanket from the cot in the corner and draped it over the man, and sat down near the fire, letting its heat seep into his tired bones. The room flickered with quiet life again. Wood crackling, the steady breathing of the wounded man, the faint sigh of wind outside. But beneath it all, a heavy tension lingered. Mason's instincts told him this wasn't finished. He glanced once more at the officer's weapon lying beside the couch. standard issue Glock 22. The magazine was half empty. Whatever had gone down out there, the man had fought back. Hard. Mason cleaned his hands, then pulled a metal poker from the fireplace and wedged it against the door handle, just in case. Bolt shifted, ears twitching at the faint moan of the wind. "It's all right, buddy," Mason said softly, though even he didn't believe it. "We're safe for tonight." He sat back, watching the firelight dance against the walls, the storm still screaming beyond the windows. The snow kept falling, burying the world outside. But inside that tiny cabin, there was warmth, life, and the fragile calm before whatever came next. The fire had long burned down to glowing embers by the time the first gray light of dawn slipped through a crack in the curtains. Mason stirred on the floor beside the hearth, stiff from sleeping on old wood planks and wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Bolt was already up, pacing near the door with his ears angled forward. His breath puffed into the cold morning air still clinging to the cabin's corners. Mason rubbed his eyes and sat up slowly, glancing at the couch. Officer Luke Harlan remained motionless under the thick blanket. His face had regained a bit of color, and the bandages on his shoulder were dry. No fresh bleeding. Mason stood, approached, and gently pressed his wrist for a pulse. Steady. Stronger than last night. "Still breathing," Mason muttered. "That's something." He walked to the small window beside the stove and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The storm had passed. Pine trees stood cloaked in white, and a quiet hush hung over the clearing. The eerie stillness that followed violence and snow. The world looked peaceful, but Mason had seen enough battlefields to know peace was often a lie. He grabbed his boots, pulled them on, and stepped out onto the porch with Bolt following at his heels. The wood creaked beneath his weight. A gust of wind rattled a loose panel on the side of the cabin. He scanned the tree line out of habit. Then he saw it. In the snow about 15 feet from the porch, not deer prints, not rabbit, human. Partial footprints. Not clean, but heavy. A dragging motion behind one. Someone had limped or crouched low. The trail led from the woods, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. "Bolt," Mason said quietly. The dog followed his gaze, sniffed the air, and let out a sharp, low bark. Mason stepped down into the snow, careful not to disturb the tracks. The prints weren't from him, and definitely not from Luke. Someone had been here, watching. Maybe last night, maybe while he slept. He didn't follow the prints, not yet. Back inside, the warmth hit his face like a blanket. He bolted the door, drew the curtain again, and moved back toward Luke, who now stirred beneath the blanket. Luke blinked, eyelids heavy, pupils adjusting to the light. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Still alive?" "Yeah," Mason said, crouching beside him. "You are, barely." Luke tried to sit up but winced immediately, his face twisting with pain. "Take it slow. You lost a lot of blood. I stitched the worst of it, but that shoulder's going to hurt like hell." "Where am I?" "My cabin. Off the ridge, just past Hollow Pine Trail. You got lucky I was out walking with my dog. Any longer out there and you'd have frozen to death." Luke breathed slowly, then looked around the room. "Radio. Phone? Dead. No signal. And your radio was just static. We're cut off until I can hike into town or get to this storm cleared." Luke swallowed, then nodded as if remembering. "They blocked the signal. Must have had a jammer. That's how they set the trap." Mason leaned forward slightly. "What happened?" Luke shifted. "Routine patrol. We'd gotten tips. Local truckers said there were strange vehicles moving through the North Road late at night. No plates, covered windows. I followed one. White cargo truck, no company name. I tailed it until it turned off onto a utility access road near the edge of county jurisdiction." He paused, breathing heavier. "I didn't even get close. Another vehicle cut me off. 3 guys stepped out, dressed like road workers, high-vis vests, boots, but they moved like professionals, military style. One of them had an AR. No hesitation. Opened fire right at my windshield. And they didn't finish the job? Mason asked. They thought they did. Bullet hit my shoulder, spun me sideways. I got out of the car and crawled before I blacked out. Guess they didn't want to check the body in a snowstorm. He managed a grim smile. Their mistake. Mason stood and paced toward the window again. You said white truck. No plates? Yeah, Luke replied. The kind you'd rent from a warehouse. Blank, clean, but it was too big for a local delivery. Looked like it could haul a dozen people in the back. Mason's brow furrowed. You think it was smuggling? Luke nodded. Drugs at first, but then the reports got stranger. People disappearing. Homeless men from the shelter in town. Runaways. Not the usual trafficking suspects. It's like someone's cleaning the streets without leaving bodies. Did you get any IDs? No, just a word. Written on a warehouse door in one of the tips. Luke shifted again, grimacing. Everlake. Mason stilled. I've heard that name, he said. Found a note in your jacket pocket. Said Everlake Shipment. 2230, North Access Road. Luke's jaw tightened. They were moving something last night. I got too close. Mason didn't say anything for a while. The fire cracked, wood splitting open. Bolt sat beside Luke now, tail wagging faintly. Luke glanced at the dog. He yours? Yeah, his name's Bolt. We served together in Afghanistan. He's better at reading trouble than I am. He's got good instincts, Luke muttered. Mason nodded but kept his eyes on the window. You're not safe here, and if they followed you that far into the woods, they might come looking again. They think I'm dead, Luke replied, but it didn't sound like conviction. No, Mason said. They're professionals. Professionals check. He reached for the fireplace poker and slid it quietly across the floor to his chair. Then he walked back to the door, reinforced the lock again, and grabbed the hunting rifle from the wall. Not regulation issue, just an old Winchester with a cracked stock, but it would do the job. Outside, the snow was falling again, light, soft, but Mason knew what hid behind it now. The sun was a dull blur behind the thick morning clouds as Mason packed the last of the gauze and painkillers into his satchel. Luke sat upright on the couch, his injured arm bound tightly against his chest. He looked pale, but determined. I can walk, he said, wincing as he pushed himself to his feet. You'll limp, Mason replied, zipping the bag, but you'll move. That's enough for now. Luke was dressed in the same blood-stained patrol pants, but Mason had loaned him a clean gray thermal shirt and his spare Army field jacket. It hung a bit loose on Luke's lean frame, but it would keep him warm. Bolt's already picking something up, Mason added, nodding toward the German shepherd, who stood by the door, tail low and alert. The dog had been restless since dawn, pacing, sniffing near the windows, circling back toward the eastern edge of the clearing. I trust him, Luke said. Let's see where he leads. Mason opened the door, and the cold hit them in the chest like a slap. Snow had settled deep overnight, muffling every sound. The forest was hushed, as if waiting. Bolt trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tracing an invisible line through the snow-laden trees. They followed, careful and quiet. Mason carried a hunting rifle slung across his shoulder. Luke, despite the pain, insisted on keeping his sidearm loaded and within reach. After 10 minutes, Bolt stopped at the edge of a tire track nearly hidden beneath a thin drift. The snow had partially covered it, but the heavy compression was still visible, deep, wide, fresh enough to have been left during the storm. Mason crouched down, studying the pattern. Dual rear wheels. This wasn't a pickup, probably a medium box truck, like the one you saw. Which means they were close, Luke said. Maybe still are. Bolt sniffed the track and turned, cutting off into the trees at an angle, following the tire line deeper into the forest. Mason and Luke kept close behind, every branch, creek, and distant raven call making them tense. After nearly an hour of navigating through dense undergrowth and icy ravines, they reached a break in the woods. A rusted, chain-link fence surrounded what looked like an abandoned industrial warehouse. Snow had gathered in uneven piles against the outer walls. The place looked like it hadn't seen official use in years. A faded metal sign above the gate read, "Red Fern Storage, closed since 2009. Bolt stopped at the fence, barking twice, sharply. Mason scanned the area. No cameras, no footprints, no vehicles in sight, but someone's been using this place. They climbed through a tear in the fence, careful not to leave obvious tracks near the gate. Mason motioned for silence and approached the warehouse doors. They were padlocked, but the lock had been recently tampered with. The scratches were fresh. Using a pry bar from his bag, Mason popped it open with a few calculated strikes. The heavy door groaned as it slid back. Inside, the air was cold and metallic, filled with the scent of rust and mildew. Shafts of light cut through holes in the roof, illuminating patches of the floor. In the far corner stood a cluster of crates, a folding metal chair, and a dirty mattress on the ground. Luke moved toward a table piled with clutter. On top sat a broken pair of handcuffs, one side still bloody. Mason stepped further in and spotted something under a tarp. A plastic bin half filled with sealed plastic bags containing personal items. Socks, toothbrushes, half-used IDs, torn notebooks. Luke picked up one of the papers and squinted. "Look at this," he said, holding up a laminated tag. "It's a wristband, like from a hospital." Mason took it. The name had been smudged, but under it was a QR code. Next to it, half buried under a toolbox, was a folder. Inside were printed sheets, each one with a name, age, and a matching QR code. "Most of these people, they're listed as transient, missing, or last seen at shelters," Mason said, flipping through the pages. "They're targeting the vulnerable." Luke clenched his jaw. "This is a holding site. They're sorting people, taking IDs, stripping possessions." Mason pointed at one of the QR sheets. This one had a note scribbled on the corner. "Transfer, MedPoint South, Quarantine Wing, hold for transport." "MedPoint South?" Luke echoed. "That's the old quarantine clinic near the highway. Was shut down after the outbreak in 21. Mason remembered it. The place had been used for temporary isolation during a flu outbreak, then abruptly closed when the state pulled funding. Now, its fenced-in compound, private rooms, and underground loading docks made it perfect for something darker. "I thought it was boarded up," Luke muttered. "Someone unboarded it." Bolt barked again, this time toward a side door. They went to check it, but it was chained from the outside. Through the dirty glass window, Mason could just make out another plastic bin, this one with discarded shoes. Children's sizes. Luke's face hardened. "We need proof. Enough to get the feds involved." Mason pulled out his phone and began taking photos of everything. The handcuffs, the crates, the QR lists, the wristbands. He pocketed a few documents for evidence. Then, a low mechanical whine caught Bolt's attention. The dog froze, ears erect, growling low. "What is it?" Mason asked. Bolt looked toward the rear of the building, then darted to the broken panel near the ground. Mason followed and peered through the gap. Far off, beyond the back of the warehouse, down a barely visible snow-covered trail. Fresh tire tracks still steaming in the cold. "They were just here," Mason said quietly, "and they're coming back." Luke nodded once. "Then we'd better not be." The snow had stopped falling by the time Mason and Luke made it back to the cabin just after sundown. They said little on the way. The cold air stung their faces, and both were drained, physically from the trek, emotionally from what they'd uncovered. The warehouse, the QR lists, the unmistakable signs of human trafficking, none of it was theoretical anymore. The cabin stood quiet, half buried in snow, smoke curling gently from the chimney Mason had left burning. Bolt climbed the steps first, sniffing the porch, tail stiff. Mason paused. "What is it, boy?" he asked, eyeing the dog's posture. Bolt didn't bark, but he hovered near the door with his ears alert and body tense. Mason stepped up beside him and tested the door. Still locked from the inside, undisturbed. He opened it carefully, scanning the room with the flashlight before entering. Nothing appeared out of place. The fire had dimmed, but not gone out. The blankets still on the floor where they'd been left. The gear untouched. Luke entered slowly behind him, clearly in pain. He sat down near the stove, exhaling. "Still feels like someone's watching," he muttered. Mason didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward the coat rack and pulled Luke's jacket from its hook. Something had been bothering him since earlier in the warehouse, an itch he couldn't shake. He turned the coat over, then felt along the lining. Near the back hem, stitched into the fabric, he felt a small, hard bump. "Found something," he said. Using a knife, he cut a slit in the inner seam and pulled out a black plastic disc, half the size of a coin, flat, with a blinking red dot barely visible in the low light. "Tracker," Mason confirmed. "Military grade. Not something you pick up at the corner store." Luke paled. "They've been tracking me. Since the ambush." Mason stood up, walked to the fireplace, and tossed the device into the flames. It sparked once before melting into the coals. "They knew you survived," he said darkly. "They knew you'd run. They probably followed the signal all the way here." Luke was already on his feet, pain forgotten. "Then we need to go. Now." Bolt barked once, sharp, loud. Then the world outside shattered. A blinding light flooded the windows. The engine roar came a second later, a truck, fast and close. Then the crash. Something smashed against the porch, splintering wood and glass. The front door blew inward. Mason grabbed Luke and shoved him behind the couch. Bolt growled and lunged forward but stopped short, blocking the path. The truck, a matte black pickup with no headlights, had rammed the cabin head-on. Mason could see it now through the broken frame, steam hissing from the hood. Two shadowed figures leapt from the vehicle, one holding what looked like an automatic rifle. "Move!" Mason shouted, dragging Luke toward the back exit. Gunfire tore through the front wall, sending wood chips and glass raining. Bolt darted ahead, barking wildly, leading them out through the kitchen and toward the back storage shed. Mason didn't hesitate. He and Luke threw open the back door, sprinted through the snow as bullets tore into the cabin behind them. Smoke followed as fire caught on the spilled kerosene from the overturned lantern. They didn't stop until they reached the base of the ridge, where a half-buried culvert tunnel ran beneath the old access road. Mason had reinforced it months ago as an emergency storage for firewood and fuel. Tonight, it would serve another purpose. Bolt crawled in first. Mason helped Luke inside, then followed, pulling the rusted door closed behind them. Inside was dark, cold, and dry. Mason struck a match, lighting a single emergency candle he kept stashed in a metal box. The flickering light revealed the cramped space, just tall enough to sit upright, walls lined with crates. Luke leaned back, clutching his shoulder, breath ragged. "You all right?" Mason asked. "Just bruised," Luke muttered. "Didn't get hit again, you?" "Same." Mason sat back against a crate. "But the cabin's gone. No going back." The orange glow from the distant flames was visible through a crack in the tunnel's rusted door. "They wanted to finish what they started," Luke said, "but they underestimated Bolt." The dog, resting beside them, wagged his tail once and lowered his head. "They weren't here to threaten. That was a kill strike," Mason said flatly. "The GPS tracker, the delay after the warehouse, this was premeditated. They waited for nightfall." Luke nodded grimly. "Which means they know we're close to something, and they're getting desperate." Silence filled the space. The fire outside continued to crackle. Mason stared into the flame, jaw tight. "We need to strike first," he said quietly. Luke didn't answer right away. Then he leaned forward, voice steady despite the exhaustion. "We're going to Med Point South," he said. "Tonight, if we can." Mason looked at Bolt, then back at Luke. "Then we don't stop moving." The night was bitter cold as Mason, Luke, and Bolt moved silently through the snow-covered woods. Their breaths came out in quick white bursts, the faint moonlight catching on the frost in their beards and jackets. The path ahead was narrow, hemmed in by old pine trees heavy with ice. There was no road, only memory and instinct guiding them toward Med Point South. Luke's condition had improved slightly, though the bandaged shoulder still throbbed with every movement. He wore Mason's old field jacket, zipped high, and a black knit cap pulled low to cover his ears. His steps were uneven, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the darkness for movement. Mason moved ahead, rifle ready, his gloved fingers steady on the stock. His military instincts never fully rested. He'd memorized every terrain shift from his last recon of the area, leading them now along a snow-hidden utility line that once powered the abandoned quarantine clinic. Bolt trailed close behind, nose low, ears alert, every step deliberate. They arrived at the southern fence line of Med Point just before midnight. The building stood like a carcass under the moon, gray concrete walls, rusted metal gates, frost-covered windows. The front had been boarded, but part of the side entrance was peeled back as if something, or someone, had pried it open from the inside. "This is it," Mason whispered, crouching behind a dead generator. "No power, no motion, looks quiet." Luke knelt beside him. Too quiet. Mason nodded, then turned to Bolt. "Scout." The dog darted forward, weaving low through snow and debris, pausing near the door to sniff. Then he returned with a short, low bark. The signal was clear. No recent activity within. They entered through the side corridor, weapons drawn. The inside was colder than the air outside. Long abandoned gurneys lined the hallways. Fluorescent lights overhead flickered uselessly, some hanging loose from broken fixtures. Rust-stained walls bore faded biohazard signs and emergency arrows pointing nowhere. "This place reeks of history," Luke muttered. "I used to patrol here during the outbreak. They closed it fast. Too fast." Mason didn't answer. His eyes scanned the corners, watching for tripwires, infrared beams, or worse. They reached the admin wing, where office doors hung crooked and broken keyboards littered the floor. One room, however, looked different. More recent footprints in the dust and one drawer pulled open. Mason kicked it fully aside and shone his light inside. Papers, maps, names. Luke sifted through them with his good hand. Shipment logs, but no real product listed. Just initials, numbers, and dates. "Wait, here." He pulled out a sealed envelope. On the front was scrawled in block letters, "Transfer clearance, Project Everlake." Mason opened it carefully. Inside were documents stamped with the logo of a private logistics company. Skywell Integrated Freight, and a list of license plate. Numbers, some with check marks, others crossed out. "This is what we need," he said. "This proves coordination between the trafficking and corporate fronts." Then the hallway behind them exploded in a whisper of glass and smoke. A bullet cracked through the window, silenced, sharp. Mason ducked. Luke hit the floor. Bolt snarled and leapt sideways. They scrambled behind a filing cabinet. Another round punched through the doorframe above them, splintering wood. "Suppressor," Mason muttered. "They're inside." Luke winced as he shifted position. "How the hell did they know we were coming?" Mason's jaw clenched. "We've been watched since the warehouse. We just didn't know how closely." He peeked out, saw the faint silhouette of a man in black moving down the hallway, rifle raised, NV goggles glowing faintly green in the dark. There were at least two more shadows behind him, moving in formation. "We need a way out," Luke said. Bolt growled low beside them, eyes trained behind them. Then suddenly, the dog lunged, knocking Luke flat to the ground just as a bullet slammed into the wall exactly where Luke's head had been. The silenced rifle barked again, but too late. Bolt had already moved, flanking through the other side of the room. Mason fired a single shot toward the hallway, then grabbed the closest file bag. He slung it over his shoulder and reached for Luke. "Move!" They ducked through a maintenance door and sprinted down a dark corridor. The emergency lights flickered faintly, barely enough to see. Footsteps echoed behind them, fast, confident. "They're pushing us out," Mason said, "trying to funnel us." "We're not going out the front," Luke replied, panting. "No, basement." They reached a stairwell. Mason kicked open the door and led them down the steps two at a time. The concrete walls echoed every movement. At the bottom, an old laundry chute lay half-collapsed beside a broken dolly. Mason turned left toward a rusted exit marked Supplies. Cold storage. Bolt barked again, this time short and urgent. They were being boxed in. Mason dropped to one knee and scanned the pipes above. Then he spotted it, an old air duct near the floor, the cover half hanging off. "Bolt, go!" he whispered. The dog dove in without hesitation. Mason followed, dragging Luke behind. They crawled through the freezing tunnel as the sound of boots thundered behind them in the hall. After several minutes of darkness, they emerged into a tree line behind the facility, just beyond the rear security gate. The world was quiet again, until a burst of automatic fire raked the air behind them. But it was too late. They were gone. They didn't stop running until they reached the ridge. Breathing hard, Luke collapsed near a fallen log. Mason dropped beside him, clutching the folder they'd retrieved. Bolt sat between them, tongue lolling, chest heaving. "You okay?" Mason asked. Luke nodded slowly. "Thanks to Bolt." Mason looked at the shredded folder. The edges were torn, but the contents were dry. "It wasn't a wasted trip," he said. "We got something." They looked back at the trees. But somewhere behind that darkness they knew. They were being hunted now. The morning after the ambush was harsh, even as sunlight filtered through the thinning cloud cover. Mason, Luke, and Bolt had made camp in a hunter's blind perched high in the pines, half collapsed, but dry and elevated enough to offer cover. Luke's shoulder was bandaged again, the bleeding under control. Mason had spread out the folder they recovered from Medpoint South across a tarp, sorting through page after page of documents stained with mildew and time. Some pages listed shipment codes and logistical jargon. Others, more chilling, contained partial ID photos, first names, dates of disappearance, all linked to transfers marked with a logo, a sharp triangle intersecting 3 horizontal lines, the insignia of Everlake Solutions. Luke leaned forward, wincing slightly, and traced his finger down a printed spreadsheet. "This one? Look. Unit code ES09A. These were transported from an isolation wing to Off-Site Facility 3, but there's no address listed. They scrubbed the location," Mason replied. "They knew someone might get this far." He held up another page, a contract copy signed by a logistics manager from a company called Skywell Integrated Freight, with a signature line from Everlake Solutions. The letterhead bore the name Harold B. Lanes, listed as Senior External Compliance Director. "It doesn't sound like a field guy," Mason said. "Probably sits behind a desk pushing papers while others get their hands dirty." Luke nodded grimly. "Let's find out who he works for." They hiked to the nearest ranger outpost, a small maintenance shack with solar panels and an emergency radio. It was locked, but Mason picked it open in seconds. Inside was an old laptop hooked to a satellite uplink. The signal was weak, but enough to run background checks through encrypted federal portals Luke still had access to. While Luke searched for financials and shell companies, Mason warmed his hands on a stovetop heater. Bolt paced the shack slowly, glancing between them. After several minutes, Luke clicked through a page, paused, then leaned closer. "Got something." Mason walked over. On screen was a flowchart of Everlake Solutions' corporate structure. It showed dozens of subcontractors, each registered under vague names: Deltor Services, Wendover Supply Chain, North End Leasing. But the common thread: funding lines from Councilman Richard Halden, a 58-year-old white male from the city of Southwell, currently serving his 3rd term on the city council. Luke read from the screen. Halden runs the committee responsible for emergency public health funding. Last year, he approved a budget for off-site care and rehabilitation logistics. Millions in grant money, half of it funneled to Everlake. "Public money for private trafficking," Mason said darkly. "Perfect cover." Luke clenched his jaw. "If we can tie Halden to these transfers, this whole thing blows wide. Open." Then Mason froze. "What?" Luke asked. Mason tapped one of the files on the floor. It showed photos of individuals from a transfer list. Faded, grainy ID shots, some obviously taken in medical settings. There were faces there that seemed hauntingly familiar. "We need someone to verify these people," Mason said. "Someone who worked at the clinic before it shut down." Luke looked up. "I think I know who." Her name was Mabel Griggs, a retired nurse in her late 60s who used to work at MedPoint South during the flu outbreak in 2021. She lived in a trailer on the outskirts of West Point, a town half a day's hike through backroads and forest trails. Mabel was short, round-shouldered, with gray-streaked auburn hair tied back in a loose bun. She wore thick glasses and a threadbare flannel jacket over a sweater with 2 holes at the cuffs. Her home smelled of lavender and old coffee. A ceramic angel collection lined the kitchen windowsill. Mason and Luke found her just before sundown. She welcomed them with a confused expression until Luke showed her his badge and explained what they'd found. Mabel's hands shook slightly as she flipped through the printouts. "This one," she said softly, pointing at a young man with a shaved head and distant eyes. "That's Jesse. He came in with symptoms like the others. They said he was transferred to a recovery center, but I never saw him leave. I asked the new admin, and she said he'd already been processed. I didn't know what that meant." She flipped another page. "And her. That's Tabitha. I gave her last dose of antibiotics. She cried when they took her out in the middle of the night. Said something didn't feel right." Luke nodded. "Can you sign a statement confirming this?" "I'll do more than that," Mabel said, her voice suddenly firm. "I've kept records. Names, times, notes they told us to throw out. I kept them in case something like this came back to haunt us." She stood and shuffled to the back room, returning with a large folder wrapped in twine. Dozens of handwritten notes filled it. Daily logs, unauthorized memos, scribbled shifts where patients were marked as moved without transportation forms. "This will help," Mason said, taking the bundle carefully. "You might have just saved a lot of lives." Mabel gave a faint smile. "I always said, if the truth doesn't burn you, it'll light someone else's way." As they left, Bolt looked back at her, tail wagging once. Back at the edge of the woods, Mason made camp near an abandoned shed off an old hunting trail. Luke reviewed the documents under the red glow of a tactical flashlight, his face pale but focused. "They moved fast," he murmured. "Whoever planned this knew they needed powerful names to keep it buried." Mason sipped from a thermos of weak coffee. "And now we know who's pulling the strings." Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling branches overhead. But for the first time in days, they weren't running. They were getting ready to fight back. The woods were quiet, but not calm, the kind of silence that came before something broke. Mason leaned against the hood of a rusted utility truck parked on a ridge overlooking the West Freight Yard of Southwell, the same yard where Everlake Solutions operated one of its unmarked depots. From here, he could see the spotlights casting thin arcs across the snow-dusted containers and the line of trailers stretching toward the old rail tracks. Luke sat in the passenger seat, one arm still bandaged, but his voice sharp as he tapped into the encrypted comlink wired into a handheld device. The wind outside was whispered through the pines, but inside the cab, strategy filled the air like static. "I spoke with Reed Carter," Luke said. "He's still with SWAT, but unofficial now, running black bag assignments for missing persons. He agreed to help." Reed Carter was 41, tall and wiry, with weathered features and a calm stare honed by years of forced entries and hostage standoffs. Former Marine turned law enforcement, Reed had worked with Luke for nearly a decade before transferring to a federal task force. His sense of justice had grown sharper, not softer. He wore civilian tactical gear, matte black, no identifiers, and kept his team small. 2 operators, both ex-military, quiet and loyal. "He believes us?" Mason asked. "He saw the files," Luke replied, "and he lost a cousin who went missing from a detox clinic. No one ever found her." That was all Mason needed to hear. By nightfall, the trap had been set. Using a forged manifest pulled from the documents recovered at MedPoint, Luke posed as a mid-level logistics contractor delivering a final shipment from Facility 3 to the main yard. A transfer meant to be off the books, no questions asked. The note was sent through a dummy encrypted channel designed to reach Everlake's handler directly. the kind of bait that would either be ignored or trigger someone big enough to want it erased. They didn't have to wait long. An hour later, a reply came. Delivery confirmed. Send verification with driver ID. Meet at loading dock 4, 0100. Reed's team moved into position. The plan was simple. Intercept the handler, record the exchange, and extract enough evidence to tie the entire operation, and Councilman Halden, to Everlake's trafficking network. Bolt, meanwhile, had been busy. For the past 24 hours, Mason had drilled him on new scent commands using a fleece cap taken from one of the missing girls in Mabel's records. Bolt had always been a detection dog, trained to sniff for explosives and narcotics, but now he was laser-focused on human scent, specifically the missing. "Find Joy," Mason whispered, holding out the cap. Bolt sniffed it, ears twitching. Then he turned sharply toward the yard. They moved under cover of night. Dock 4 sat at the far end of the depot, partially hidden by stacked crates and disconnected trailers. The air smelled of oil, salt, and diesel. A single bulb flickered above the dock ramp, and under it stood a man in a long winter coat and gloves, pacing while speaking into a phone. "ID matches Halden's driver," Luke murmured. "Not the councilman, but close." Mason crouched behind the side of the truck, waiting. Then Bolt stopped. He barked. Not loudly, but with a pitch Mason knew too well. Discovery. Mason looked where Bolt had turned, a nondescript refrigerated trailer parked behind the shipping office. There was no noise, no vibration, nothing. But the dog wouldn't move. Mason gave a single hand signal to Reed, who nodded. They diverted course toward the trailer while Luke stayed behind to monitor the decoy transaction. Bolt sniffed along the trailer's lower seam, then pawed once at the door. Mason stepped forward and unlatched the back. It creaked as he opened it, cold vapor billowing out. The interior was lit with a blue emergency light. Inside, curled beneath silver thermal blankets and chained to the interior bar, was a girl. She looked no older than 16, wrapped in a coat several sizes too big, eyes wide and glassy with fear. Her skin was flushed with cold, lips trembling. Her wrists bore bruises beneath the blankets. "Joy?" Mason asked softly. The girl blinked. "Yes," she whispered. He stepped in, bolt cutters in hand, and clipped the restraints. Outside, muffled shouting rose near Dock 4. Voices barking orders, the sharp footfalls of people scrambling. "Secure the girl," Mason said into his comm. "Joy located. Repeat, Joy located." Reed's voice came through. "They're scattering. We have 2 in custody, 1 trying to flee through the rail yard." Luke's voice followed. "We've got the driver. He was wearing a body cam." Mason helped Joy into a thick parka and pulled her close as Bolt trotted beside them. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the dock, running hard, dark coat flapping. He wasn't going for the gates. He was headed toward a black SUV parked near the depot's side entrance. Mason recognized the shape of the man's shoulders. "Halden," he muttered. He raised his rifle, but stopped. A flash of headlights. Another SUV pulled in from the other side. Unmarked, but heavy, tinted. The first vehicle was blocked. Within seconds, Reed's men had Halden pinned against the hood. "Councilman Richard Halden," one of them said. "You're under federal detainment on suspicion of human trafficking, misuse of emergency funds, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." Halden's face was pale and expressionless, as if he still believed this was all a mistake that would disappear. But Mason knew better. He stood back as medics arrived to check Joy's vitals, and Bolt sat beside him, tail brushing the frost-coated ground. They'd sprung the trap, and the web had finally started to unravel. The snow hadn't stopped, not for days. But this morning it felt different, less like a storm, more like a cleansing. Light broke through heavy clouds in hazy golden shafts as the convoy of emergency vehicles wound its way down from the freight yard. Red and blue lights pulsed against the white wilderness, illuminating a victory that had cost more than anyone would ever know. Mason stood near the edge of the perimeter, arms crossed against the cold. His wool-lined jacket, old and unmarked, was dusted with flakes. He didn't speak much. He never did, but his eyes tracked everything. The stretchers being lifted into ambulances, the warm blankets wrapped around gaunt shoulders, the stunned silence of 17 rescued souls blinking into a world they thought they'd never see again. Beside him, Bolt sat alert, tail sweeping snow in slow arcs. He looked up every time a stretcher passed, not out of fear, but memory. Luke stood not far away, his arm still in a sling but chin held high. He wore a standard sheriff's jacket now, though its badge was barely visible beneath soot and frost. The bandage on his side peeked out from beneath the collar. He hadn't slept, but there was a fire in his eyes again, one that had gone out the night he was ambushed in those woods. Mason glanced over as a news van pulled up beyond the barricade. A young female reporter in a red parka stepped out, followed by a cameraman hoisting a shoulder rig. Her name tag read Kylie Monroe, a field journalist known for chasing real stories, not just sound bites. Late 20s, sharp voice, boots muddy. She ignored the PR officers and headed straight for Luke. "Deputy Harrison," she called. "Word is this wasn't an official raid, that the call came from a private channel. Care to comment?" Luke raised an eyebrow. "I followed the evidence," he said, voice hoarse, "and when the system didn't move fast enough, I asked for help." Kylie smiled. "And the man who helped you, he's not listed anywhere. Who is he?" Luke glanced toward Mason, then back at the reporter. "Let's just say he was exactly where I needed him to be." The camera swung toward Mason, but he turned slightly, avoiding the full frame. Bolt moved closer, pressing against his leg. Later that afternoon, under a large military tent set up for triage, the sheriff's department held a brief ceremony. 17 victims had been rescued, all confirmed missing persons, most from shelters or transitional housing centers. 8 arrests had been made on site, including warehouse personnel and 2 mid-level coordinators. Councilman Richard Halden had been taken into federal custody before sunrise, his political immunity stripped after overwhelming evidence linked him to Everlake's shadow accounts and illegal labor streams. Inside the tent, the mood was heavy but hopeful. Folded cots were lined with warm food trays, IV stands, and therapy dogs brought in by volunteers. Some of the victims cried, others stared. One girl, Joy, refused to let go of Bolt's ear, even as doctors checked her vitals. Sheriff Donnelly, a graying man with a weary face, stepped onto the small makeshift stage with a clipboard in hand. He cleared his throat. "Today," he began, "we witnessed something rare. Not just justice, but persistence, from those who refused to look the other way." He turned to Luke. "Deputy Luke Harrison, for surviving an attack meant to silence you, for uncovering a network that spanned state lines, and for risking your life to finish what others wouldn't start. You are hereby awarded the Medal of Valor." Applause broke, raw and real. Luke stepped forward, jaw tight with emotion. He accepted the medal, then looked toward the back of the tent. Sheriff Donnelly continued, "And though he doesn't wear a badge, though he never asked to be here, there's someone else without whom none of this would have happened." He nodded toward Mason. "A man who saw something in the snow and didn't walk away, who sheltered a stranger, tracked a ghost, and fought beside us without a title. Mason Calloway. You may not wear a uniform, but this county will remember your name." The crowd turned as Mason slowly stepped forward, hesitant at first. He didn't like crowds, he didn't like recognition, but today he accepted it. The sheriff smiled. "We call him now," he said, raising his voice, "the warrior in the shadows." A hush fell, then cheers erupted. Bolt barked once, loud and proud. Sheriff Donnelly chuckled and looked down at the dog. "And finally, our 4-legged miracle." He knelt, pulling out a small metal badge shaped like a paw print. "Bolt, for service beyond instinct, for saving lives, for bravery under fire, you are officially sworn in as volunteer K-9 officer of Clear Ridge County." Bolt wagged his tail, tongue lolling. while Mason bent to clip the badge gently onto his collar. It glinted like hope. Outside the tent, the snow began to lighten, and somewhere far beyond the hills the sirens faded, not into silence but into peace. Sometimes miracles don't come with trumpet sounds or angel wings. Sometimes they walk beside us in silence through the snow, wearing no badge, no title, just a heart willing to help. In this story, it wasn't just the courage of a wounded officer or the strength of a retired soldier that saved lives. It was the invisible hand of God guiding them through darkness. A burned cabin, a silent trail, a dog's bark in the night. They were not coincidences, but quiet echoes of divine intervention. In our daily lives, we may not chase criminals or uncover hidden crimes, but we all have moments where we must choose between comfort and courage, silence and truth. When we do the right thing, even if no one sees it, we become part of something greater than ourselves. If you believe in second chances, in the power of loyalty, in the unseen ways God protects and leads us, then let this story remind you, even in a world full of darkness, there are still warriors in the shadows, and angels on 4 legs. Drop an amen in the comments if you believe God still works through people and animals alike. Don't forget to like, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next tale of courage and faith. May God bless you and your family. Keep your heart open, because sometimes miracles arrive wearing fur.